My name is Edward Hollis, and I am 81 years old. 4 months ago, my 16-year-old grandson sat across from me at his own kitchen table, rolled his eyes as I started telling him about a training exercise from my early years in the Army, and said, loud enough for his mother to hear from the next room, that my old war stories were boring and that he'd really rather just look at his phone. What my grandson didn't know, and what none of us could have predicted that particular afternoon, was that 6 weeks later, sitting in a recruiter's office to ask his own first questions about enlisting, the recruiting sergeant would look up from his computer screen after entering my grandson's last name, pause, and ask, with real weight in his voice, whether he happened to be related to a Master Sergeant Edward Hollis. If you've ever had your history dismissed as irrelevant by someone too young to understand what that history actually cost, stay with me until the end. This story isn't about proving my grandson wrong for being bored. It's about the strange, quiet way a name can carry weight in rooms you'll never personally enter, decades after you've stopped thinking anyone still remembers it. Welcome to Silent Honor USA, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most. If this story moves you, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly how this moment unfolded. I need to tell you who I was before I tell you about that kitchen table, because otherwise a recruiter recognizing a name won't carry the weight it's actually supposed to carry. Vi enlisted in the Army in 1963, 18 years old, out of a small town outside of Spokane, Washington. The son of a man who ran a modest hardware store and a mother who kept the books for half the small businesses in town. I served 3 tours across Vietnam, from 1964 through 1970, with brief rotations stateside between deployments, and I want to be honest that I've spent most of the 60 years since carrying those years the way most men of my generation carry them, privately, without much interest in discussing the specifics with anyone who wasn't there. I want to tell you specifically about the shape of my service, because it matters enormously to understanding everything that happened decades later. I served the majority of my time in a long-range reconnaissance capacity, small teams operating deep in contested territory, gathering intelligence that shaped decisions made considerably above my own rank, work that demanded a particular kind of discipline, patience, and trust between a small number of men who depended entirely on each other for survival. I want to be honest about the actual weight of that work, because the specific nature of long-range reconnaissance meant operating for extended periods with no immediate support, no quick extraction if things went wrong, a level of exposure that shaped the rest of my life in ways I still don't fully have words for, even now. I remember, specifically, the particular discipline required of that kind of work, the way every movement, every decision, had to be made with the understanding that a single mistake could cost not just my own life, but the lives of the 3 or 4 men depending on me to make the correct call. I developed across those years a specific set of techniques for moving through difficult terrain without detection, for reading subtle signs of enemy presence that most conventional infantry training never covered in any real depth, techniques I refined through hard experience rather than any formal manual, techniques that, I would later learn, decades after I'd stopped thinking much about them, apparently still carried enough weight to be remembered by name among a certain circle of veterans. I lost 3 men from my own team across those years, soldiers whose names I still say quietly to myself every November on the specific dates they died, a private ritual I've maintained for 6 decades without ever explaining it to anyone in my family. I carried, and still carry, a particular kind of survivor's weight that I've never fully resolved, only learned to live alongside. The way you learn to live alongside a permanent, familiar ache. I want to be honest that this particular weight has shaped nearly every relationship in my life since. A certain guardedness, a reluctance to discuss those years in any real detail, not because I don't trust the people around me, but because articulating that weight has always felt like it required more than most conversations, particularly family conversations at a Sunday dinner table, could reasonably hold. I stayed in the Army after Vietnam, finding, in the structure and continued purpose it offered, something I wasn't entirely sure I could replicate in civilian life, and I spent the remaining 15 years of my career, following my final tour, training incoming soldiers in reconnaissance and survival skills at a training facility, work that let me pass along, to younger men heading into their own uncertain futures, whatever hard-won knowledge might actually keep them alive. I want to describe the specific nature of that training work, because it matters enormously to the rest of this story. I developed, over those 15 years, a curriculum that went well beyond the standard training manual, incorporating lessons I'd learned through genuine trial and error, through losses I'd rather not have paid the price for, but that I was determined would teach something useful to the soldiers who came after me. I was, by most accounts from soldiers who trained under me, a demanding instructor, unwilling to let young men graduate my program without genuinely internalizing skills I believed might someday determine whether they came home. I retired in 1985 as a master sergeant, and I want to be clear that this particular chapter, like most of my service, produced no headlines, no dramatic public recognition, simply the quiet, largely invisible knowledge that I'd trained hundreds of young soldiers across those 15 years, soldiers who went on to carry what I'd taught them into their own deployments, their own careers, their own eventual retirements, most of whom I never heard from again. Their names and faces slowly fading from my memory even as, apparently, my own name continued circulating quietly among them. I met my wife Dorothy in 1971 during a stateside posting, and we married the following year. Dorothy was a nurse, patient and steady in ways that complemented my own considerably more guarded temperament, and she carried, throughout our 49 years of marriage until her passing 3 years ago, a genuine understanding that most of what I'd actually done during those years simply wasn't meant to be discussed in detail, an understanding she never pushed against, trusting instead that whatever weight I carried was mine to manage in my own way. I want to be honest that Dorothy was, for most of our marriage, the only person who ever heard the fuller version of what I'd carried home from Vietnam. Late-night conversations she never once repeated to anyone else, not even Patricia, respecting a confidence I never explicitly asked her to keep, but that she understood, instinctively, needed protecting. We had one daughter, Patricia, born in 1974, and I want to be honest that raising her, particularly during the training years when I was frequently away at various postings, created its own particular distance, one that softened considerably once I retired, but never entirely disappeared. Patricia grew up with a fairly thin understanding of what I'd actually done, knowing only the vaguest outline, 3 tours in Vietnam, some kind of specialized training role afterward, but never developing much specific curiosity about the details, an understandable gap given how little I'd ever volunteered to fill it. I remember Patricia asking me, as a teenager, whether I'd ever killed anyone, a blunt, uncomfortable question most children eventually ask a veteran parent in one form or another, and I remember giving her an answer so brief and deflective that she never asked a follow-up question again, a pattern that, looking back, set the tone for most of our conversations about my service for the following 4 decades. Patricia married her husband Kevin in 1998, and they had one son together, my grandson Tyler, now 16 years old, a bright, restless kid who I love deeply but who has grown up in a household and in a broader world where the specific weight of what my generation actually carried has become, understandably, something closer to abstract history than lived experience. I want to be fair to Tyler here, because it would be easy to paint him simply as disrespectful, and that isn't the complete picture of who he actually is. He's a good kid, genuinely, someone who does well in school, who's kind to his younger cousins, who has never once been deliberately cruel to me in any real sense. What he has, understandably given his age and his generation's general relationship with history that feels increasingly distant, is very little context for why an old man's stories about a war fought 60 years ago might actually matter. A gap in understanding that, I think, both Patricia and I had allowed to persist across his entire childhood, neither of us particularly pushing him toward a curiosity about family history that neither of us had modeled especially well ourselves. 4 months ago, I was visiting Patricia and Kevin's house for a Sunday dinner, a fairly ordinary occasion, the kind of weekly gathering that had become a comfortable routine since Dorothy's passing 3 years earlier. Patricia insisting I come by every Sunday rather than eat alone in my own quiet house. The conversation drifted, as it sometimes does, toward my service, prompted by a documentary Kevin had recently watched about Vietnam that he mentioned over dinner, describing a few details he'd found particularly striking: the specific conditions soldiers had faced, the political complexity back home that most of the documentary's runtime had focused on. I began telling a story, one I don't often tell, about a specific training exercise early in my career that had taught me something important about trusting your team under pressure. A story about a young soldier under my command who had frozen during a critical moment in a routine exercise, and the specific, patient process I'd used afterward to help him work through that fear rather than simply washing him out of the program. A story I'd told perhaps twice before in my entire life, feeling, for whatever reason, that particular evening, like sharing it, perhaps because Kevin's documentary had put me in a more reflective mood than usual. I remember describing the specific weight of that moment, watching a young man's confidence crack in front of his entire team, understanding that how I handled the next several minutes would determine whether he ever trusted himself again. And I remember feeling, as I spoke, a genuine warmth at finally sharing something I'd carried privately for so long, watching Kevin nod along with real interest, Patricia listening from where she was finishing up in the kitchen. Tyler, sitting across the table with his phone half visible in his lap, let out a visible, audible sigh partway through the story, shifting in his chair with the particular restlessness of a teenager who has clearly checked out of a conversation, and said, loud enough for Patricia to hear clearly from the kitchen, "Grandpa, no offense, but old war stories are kind of boring. Can I just look at my phone instead?" He said it without any particular malice, the way a 16-year-old says most things, a simple, unfiltered expression of genuine boredom, rather than any deliberate attempt to wound me, already reaching for his phone before I'd even finished my sentence, clearly assuming the comment carried no more weight than any other ordinary teenage complaint about a boring dinner conversation. I sat there, 81 years old, absorbing the particular sting of watching my own grandson dismiss, without any real understanding of what he was dismissing, a memory that had shaped the entire rest of my life, a story about a young soldier's fear and my own responsibility for helping him move through it, a story that, in its own small way, represented exactly the kind of quiet, patient work I'd spent 15 years of my career trying to do for hundreds of young men just like that frightened soldier. I didn't correct him, I simply nodded, made a mild comment about it being fine if he wanted to check his phone, and let the story trail off unfinished, the way these moments often do, watching Patricia shoot Tyler a brief, disapproving look from the kitchen that he either didn't notice or chose to ignore. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't primarily anger. Men of my generation develop a certain capacity to absorb this kind of casual dismissal without much visible reaction. What I felt was something quieter, a tired recognition that the specific weight I still carried from those years had simply never been transferred to Tyler in any way that meant anything to him. Because I'd never given him the material to understand it differently. Because I'd spent his entire lifetime, much like I'd spent his mother's entire childhood, treating my service as something private rather than something worth actively sharing. What happened next, I want to be absolutely clear, was not something I orchestrated in any way. I had no advance knowledge whatsoever that it was coming. About 6 weeks after that dinner, Tyler, who had been quietly considering military service for some time, a decision he'd apparently been weighing without discussing much with his parents, worked up the courage to visit a local Army recruiting office on his own, wanting to ask preliminary questions before bringing the idea home for a fuller family conversation. I learned the full details only later, from Tyler himself, but I want to describe the scene as he eventually described it to me, sitting nervously in a small office decorated with recruiting posters and a large Army seal on the wall, uncertain exactly what to expect from his first real conversation about a decision that clearly meant a great deal to him, even if he hadn't fully articulated it to his own family yet. The recruiting sergeant, a man in his early 40s named Staff Sergeant Daniel Reyes, began the standard intake conversation, asking basic questions about Tyler's age, his school performance, his general interests, working through the routine early stages of a conversation he'd clearly had hundreds of times before with hundreds of other nervous teenagers. At some point, he asked for Tyler's full name and any family history of military service. A fairly routine question meant simply to gather background information. The kind of question recruiters ask as a matter of standard procedure rather than genuine curiosity about the specific answer. Tyler mentioned, almost as an aside, that his grandfather had served in Vietnam and gave my name Edward Hollis, expecting, as he later told me, absolutely nothing beyond a polite acknowledgement, the kind of brief nod recruiters presumably gave to countless similar mentions of grandfathers and great-uncles who'd served decades earlier. Instead, Sergeant Reyes looked up from his computer screen, paused for what Tyler described as a genuinely startled moment, his fingers stopping mid-type, and asked, with real weight in his voice, "Master Sergeant Edward Hollis?" The long-range recon instructor at the training facility in the late 70s and early 80s? Tyler, by his own account, was completely caught off guard, sitting up straighter in his chair. "I mean, yeah, I think so," he said. "How do you know that?" Sergeant Reyes explained that his own father-in-law, a retired officer, had trained under me decades earlier, and that my name was still spoken of with real respect among a specific circle of veterans connected to that training program, soldiers who credited the specific survival and reconnaissance skills I'd taught them with keeping them alive during their own later deployments. He told Tyler, in detail, about specific techniques I'd developed and taught, methods still referenced informally among veterans of that era, describing, according to Tyler's later retelling, a particular exercise I'd designed for testing a soldier's composure under simulated pressure, an exercise apparently still discussed among that circle of veterans decades later as one of the more formative parts of their entire training. "Your grandfather," Sergeant Reyes told Tyler, according to Tyler's own account of the conversation, "is the reason my father-in-law is still alive to be my father-in-law. That's not an exaggeration. He tells that story every Thanksgiving." He asked, with genuine warmth, whether Tyler might be willing to bring me by the recruiting office sometime, an invitation Tyler accepted immediately, according to his own account, though I suspect at the time he was still processing the sheer surprise of what he'd just heard, the strange whiplash of walking into an office as an anonymous 16-year-old and walking out as, suddenly, someone with a name that apparently meant something to a stranger behind a desk. Tyler came home that afternoon and, for the first time in longer than I could remember, sought me out specifically to talk, finding me in my garden where I'd been tending to a small vegetable patch I've kept since retirement, and said, with an expression somewhere between confusion and genuine excitement, "Grandpa, some recruiting sergeant just told me you're basically legendary." Like, he knew your actual name before I even finished saying it. He said his father-in-law is alive because of you. I want to be honest about what I felt hearing this, standing there in my garden with dirt still on my hands. My first instinct was simple surprise, that a chance encounter with a stranger's father-in-law's memory could surface after so many decades, that a name I genuinely assumed had faded into the ordinary, unremembered background of a long career could still carry that kind of specific weight in a room I'd never enter myself. But beneath that surprise was something quieter, a recognition that the specific work I'd done training soldiers, work I genuinely believed had simply dissolved into the general, unremarkable churn of military history, had apparently left a mark considerably more lasting than I'd ever imagined it could. "I don't know about legendary," I told Tyler, setting down my gardening tools. "I trained a lot of young men. Some of them apparently still remember it." "You never told me any of that," Tyler said, sitting down on the small bench beside my garden, his earlier boredom entirely replaced now by something closer to genuine curiosity. "You never told me you trained people. I thought you were just, I don't know, a regular soldier who fought in the war. I didn't know there was like a whole other part after that." We sat together in that garden for nearly an hour that afternoon, Tyler asking real questions for the first time in his life, about the reconnaissance work, about the training program, about what it had actually meant to teach young soldiers skills that, according to a stranger he'd met that same day, had genuinely kept some of them alive decades later. I told him, in more detail than I'd shared with almost anyone outside a small circle of fellow veterans, about the 3 men I'd lost, about the specific weight I still carried every November, about why I'd developed the particular training methods that apparently still carried my name among soldiers I'd never see again. I remember specifically telling Tyler about the young soldier from the story I'd started at that Sunday dinner, the one he'd found boring, finishing it properly this time, describing how that frightened young man had gone on, eventually, to complete his training and serve a full career of his own, sending me a letter years later, one of the few I'd kept, thanking me for not giving up on him during that difficult moment. I watched Tyler's face as I described the specific contents of that letter, watched something shift in his expression, a recognition, I think, of exactly what he'd dismissed as boring weeks earlier. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," Tyler said, quietly, toward the end of that hour in the garden. "About what I said at dinner. I didn't think there was actually a whole story behind it. I just thought it was going to be like generic old guy stuff. You didn't have any reason to think differently," I told him. "I never gave you the material to think differently. That's not something I'm blaming you for, Tyler. It's simply the truth of how things were between us, until a recruiting sergeant happened to remember a name I'd genuinely forgotten still meant anything to anyone." The following weekend, at Tyler's insistence, I accompanied him back to that recruiting office, and I want to describe what happened when Sergeant Reyes saw me walk through the door. He stood immediately, extended his hand, and told me, with genuine emotion, that his father-in-law still spoke of the specific training I'd given him nearly 40 years earlier, training that had, according to the story passed down, made the difference during a difficult deployment that his father-in-law had otherwise doubted he'd survive. He described, in detail I hadn't expected any stranger to know, a specific technique I'd developed for reading terrain under low visibility conditions. A technique that, he told me, was still referenced informally by name among a certain circle of veterans connected to that training program. A detail that genuinely surprised me, given how little I'd thought about that specific method in the decades since I'd stopped teaching it. I sat in that recruiting office for the better part of an hour that afternoon, Sergeant Reyes asking his own questions now, wanting to understand more about the training program's full history, while Tyler sat beside me, listening with a quiet, focused attention I hadn't seen from him in years. Before we left, Sergeant Reyes asked whether I'd be willing to speak with some of the younger recruits occasionally, an invitation I've since taken up twice, sitting with groups of young men and women considering service, sharing, for the first time in decades, some of what I'd learned across those years. Watching their faces as I described specific lessons about trust, about discipline under pressure, about the particular weight of decisions that affect other people's lives, lessons I hadn't fully articulated out loud to anyone since I'd stopped teaching formally nearly 40 years earlier. I want to describe one specific moment from that first speaking engagement, because it has stayed with me since. A young woman, perhaps 19 years old, asked me afterward whether I still thought about the men I'd lost, a question most people are too uncomfortable to ask directly. I told her the truth, that I thought about them every day in some small way, and every November in a considerably larger one, and that the training I'd developed and taught for 15 years had been, in its own quiet way, an attempt to make sure fewer families received the kind of news my own lost soldiers' families had received. She thanked me, with real sincerity, and told me she'd remember what I'd said, a small exchange that meant more to me than I expected it to, this late in my life. In the 4 months since that Sunday dinner, something has genuinely shifted in how Tyler relates to me. He calls me now, unprompted, asking questions, wanting to understand more about specific parts of my service, about the reconnaissance techniques, about what basic training was actually like in 1963 compared to what he's since learned it looks like today. He's told his own friends, according to Patricia, about his grandfather, the recon legend, a phrase that makes me laugh every time I hear it repeated back to me, but that also carries a particular warmth I hadn't expected to feel this late in my life. He's also begun asking, more seriously now, about the process of enlisting himself. Conversations Patricia and Kevin are still working through as a family. Conversations I've stayed largely out of, believing that decision needs to remain entirely his own, rather than shaped by any renewed enthusiasm on my part. Patricia, for her part, has started asking her own questions as well, something that has surprised me perhaps more than anything else in these past 4 months. She mentioned, during a recent visit, that she'd always assumed my reluctance to discuss my service reflected simple stoicism rather than anything approaching genuine, ongoing grief, and that watching Tyler's curiosity unfold had made her realize how much she herself had never actually asked, across her entire adult life. We've had, in these past few months, several conversations, considerably more honest than anything Patricia and I managed across the preceding 4 decades. Conversations about Dorothy's role in carrying that weight alongside me, about the specific names I still say every November. Conversations I never anticipated having this late in my life. Prompted, improbably, by a 16-year-old's bored dismissal of an old story at a Sunday dinner table. Kevin, too, has approached me differently since that documentary-prompted dinner, asking on several occasions whether I'd be willing to sit down properly and let him record some of my recollections, an idea Patricia has enthusiastically encouraged, wanting, she says, to have something more permanent than memory for Tyler and any future grandchildren to eventually access, a specific, deliberate counterweight to the decades of silence that had otherwise defined how our family handled this particular chapter of our history. I've agreed, cautiously, to a handful of recorded conversations, finding the process considerably less difficult than I expected, perhaps because Tyler's genuine curiosity has made the entire exercise feel less like an obligation and more like something I actually want to leave behind. I don't tell you this story because I want credit for training soldiers decades ago, or because I need a recruiter's recognition to validate work I already knew mattered. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. The quiet, largely invisible work many of us do across our lives often outlives our own expectation of being remembered, carried forward by people we'll never meet again, surfacing in rooms we'll never personally enter, simply because what we taught, or gave, or sacrificed mattered enough to be passed along. That doesn't mean our worth depends on some unexpected recognition eventually proving it. It means the value was already there, quietly, whether or not anyone ever happened to say our name out loud again. I want to say one more thing before I close this story, something I've thought about often in these past 4 months. I don't think Tyler was wrong, exactly, to find that first version of my story boring, told the way I told it, without context, without any real sense of why it might matter to him specifically. I think the failure, if there was one, was mine. Decades of assuming that my own reluctance to discuss those years was simply a private matter, rather than something that left the people I loved most without any real way to understand who I actually was. I've spent this particular chapter of my life, these past 4 months since that Sunday dinner, trying to correct that, one conversation at a time, with Tyler, with Patricia, with anyone in my family willing to sit and actually listen. I spent 60 years assuming the specific things I'd done and taught during my military career would simply fade, unremembered, into the general, quiet background of an ordinary retired life, and I'd made a certain kind of peace with that fading, understanding it as simply the natural order of things, an old soldier's memories eventually mattering to no one but himself. It took a 16-year-old's boredom and a stranger's unexpected memory to show me exactly how wrong that assumption had been. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life whose actual history you might not fully understand, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because we have a new story like this one every week.